You were never really part of this family, Claire. The fork paused at my lips, the tines hovering an inch from my tongue, the cold salmon beginning to flake. I did not drop the fork. I did not set it down. I held it suspended while the air in the room recrystallized around those 7 words. My brother's voice had been sharp, almost bored, the way a person delivers a line they have rehearsed for years and finally found the right table to serve it. He was seated 3 places to my left, his wine glass half empty, his posture loose with the confidence of someone who had never been contradicted at a family table. I set the fork down. The ceramic plate received it without a sound. I was wearing a red pearl snap shirt, the snaps cool against my collarbone, the sleeves rolled twice to my forearms. The shirt had belonged to my grandmother Margaret Hartwell before she passed, and I had worn it as a talisman, not as armor. I had not expected to need armor tonight. I am Claire Hartwell, not Winthrop, not anymore. At 38 years old, I own and operate the Hartwell Cattle Company, a ranch I built from 50 head of cattle to a herd of 500 over 7 years. Revenue last year crossed $1.2 million. My calving success rate sits at 98%, a number that no other operation in the Texas Panhandle has touched in the past decade. I know the weight of a newborn calf in my palms, the smell of hay at dusk, the precise angle of a fence post that will hold against a winter storm. I know the law of contracts and the language of deeds because my grandmother taught me to read them before I was tall enough to see over her desk. I know that the quietest person at a table is often the only one who has read the fine print. Tell me what city you are listening from. I will wait. Good. Keep that place in mind. Because what happened next did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at a mahogany table in a law office in Amarillo, Texas, with 3 generations of Winthrop money propped up on antique china, and it happened because for 6 years I had been sending my parents a check for $2,000 every month, and for 6 years they had been siphoning every dollar of it into accounts my brother controlled. I did not know that yet, in this moment with the fork paused at my lips, but I was about to learn. The room around me was the law office of Hartwell and Associates, my grandmother's practice, the firm that had drafted the original will that named me as the sole heir of the mineral rights and the ranch itself. The will that my parents had contested the day after her funeral. The will that had been scheduled for a formal reading tonight, now that the last appeal had been exhausted. I was here because I had never stopped fighting for what she left me. My brother Christopher was here because he had never stopped believing it belonged to him. He delivered the line with a smirk. His wife, seated beside him, adjusted her diamond stud earring and looked at my mother for approval. My mother, Eleanor Winthrop, gave a small approving nod, her lips pressed into a thin line of satisfaction. My father, Charles Winthrop, stared at his plate. I looked at Christopher's smirk and I felt nothing. Not the familiar heat of anger, not the hollow ache of betrayal. I felt a cold, clinical curiosity. I noticed the slight sheen of sweat along his hairline. The way his left hand gripped the stem of his wine glass a half-second too tight. He was nervous. He knew he had said something he couldn't take back in front of witnesses. I picked up my fork again. I took a bite. I chewed slowly. I swallowed. "Thank you, Christopher," I said. "I have been waiting for you to say that to my face for a long time." The silence that followed was more satisfying than any outburst. Now, if this story resonates with you at all, if you have ever been the one who showed up, who paid the bills, who fixed the messes, who was told you were not really part of the family, I am going to ask you to do something. Hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel, because the way this nightmare ended is the reason I am telling it at all. And I promise you, the revenge is worth waiting for. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare started. It started with a grandmother who saw me clearly and a family who never did. Margaret Hartwell was the only person in my life who ever understood the geometry of my place in the world. She was a rancher's daughter who became a lawyer, and she taught me that the law was not an abstraction. It was a fence line, a water right, a boundary that could be drawn with a single signature. She taught me to read deeds before I could ride a horse. She taught me that the most dangerous person in a negotiation is the one who knows exactly what she does not have to accept. She died 9 years ago. The cancer took her in 3 months. I was 29, and I was at her bedside when she signed the last codicil to her will, leaving me the Hartwell Ranch, the mineral rights, and the controlling interest in the legal practice. She left my brother Christopher a trust fund worth $200,000, and a letter that I never read but always suspected contained the truth about his entitlement. The day after the funeral, my parents filed a will contest. They claimed that Margaret was not of sound mind when she signed the codicil, that I had unduly influenced her in her final weeks. The case dragged through probate for 7 years. During that time, I did not stop working the ranch. I grew the herd. I paid off the mortgage. I handled my parents' property tax appeals without telling them it was me drafting the letters. I settled a boundary dispute with the adjoining ranch by preparing a prescriptive easement agreement that I signed as the attorney for Hartwell and Associates, never disclosing that I was Claire Hartwell, the woman who owned the land next door. I was invisible. That was the point. My family saw a daughter who wore pearl snap shirts and smelled of cattle. They saw a woman who did not wear designer labels, who drove a pickup with a cracked windshield, who never showed up to a holiday dinner without a casserole dish in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. They saw someone who could be used. They did not see the tax appeal forms I filled out in my own hand. They did not see the easement agreement I drafted with a citation to the Texas Property Code. They did not see the box of bank statements I kept in the attic of the ranch house, the ones my husband Andrew Porter had started pulling out of a file cabinet 6 weeks ago, the ones that would blow a crater through their entire narrative. Andrew is a forensic paralegal. I met him at a continuing education seminar for estate planning professionals, and he was the first person outside my grandmother who ever told me I was smart. My family calls him my boy toy because he is 4 years younger than me and drives a 20-year-old sedan. They do not know that he can subpoena bank records in his sleep, that he understands chain of custody reports better than half the attorneys I know, that he spent the first 3 years of our marriage watching me send checks to my parents and never once said a word, because he trusted that I knew what I was doing. He found the statements on a Monday afternoon in early October. I was out on the east pasture, checking a fence line that had been sagging after the rains. The heat was still high, and I had taken off my shirt and tied it around my waist, working in a tank top, the dust caking on my arms. My phone buzzed. It was Andy. "Come home," he said. "I need to show you something." The something was a cardboard box he had found in the back corner of the attic, beneath a pile of old tax receipts. Inside were 12 bank statements, organized by year, each one showing the same pattern. On the 15th of every month for 6 years, a deposit of $2,000 appeared in a joint account held by Charles and Alina Winthrop. And on the 16th, a withdrawal of $1,500 was transferred to an account at a different institution, held solely by Christopher Winthrop. The remaining $500 stayed in my parents' account, every month, for 72 months. The total came to exactly $144,000. The exact amount I had sent them, minus the half that my parents kept for themselves. I sat down on the porch steps, the papers spread across my lap. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. The clock inside read 4:17 in the afternoon. I stared at the numbers until they stopped being numbers and started being a map of a lie so elegant, so methodical, that I could almost admire the architecture. My father had told me, every time I asked about the money, that it was complicated. "It's complicated, sweetheart," he would say, the same 3 words he used when I asked about my grandmother's estate, about the mineral rights, about the trust fund that should have been distributed years ago. "It's complicated" was his blanket, his escape hatch, his way of telling me to stay out of things I was not qualified to understand. But I understood estate law. I understood fiduciary duty. I understood that what they had done was not just a betrayal, it was a crime, fraudulent transfer, breach of fiduciary duty, possibly criminal conversion. I did not cry. I did not scream. I took a photograph of every statement with my phone. I called my forensic accountant, Maggie Chen, and asked her to start a chain of custody analysis. Then I went inside, took a shower, and put on my grandmother's red pearl snap shirt. The shirt is a physical object. It has pearlescent snaps that catch the light like small moons. It smells faintly of hay and cedar, the scent of her closet. I wore it to the reading tonight as a totem, as a reminder that I was not just Claire the rancher, Claire the invisible daughter, Claire the one who paid the bills and fixed the problems and was told she was not really part of the family. I am part of the family that matters, the one that documents everything. By the time I sat down at that mahogany table tonight, I had already filed a quiet title action on the ranch. I had already recorded the deed to the Hartwell Ranch in my maternal grandmother's maiden name, Hartwell, on the day before my wedding 3 years ago. The deed is tax parcel number 47, 203,001. It is notarized. It is recorded. And my parents never checked because they assumed I was too busy planning a wedding to know what I was doing. The fork is back in my hand. The salmon is gone. The executor is adjusting his glasses. My brother's smirk has not yet frozen, but it will. I am going to let him enjoy the sensation of having all the power for exactly 30 more seconds. I am going to tell you the number 144,000 again, because that number will invert before this night is over. First, I need to tell you what happened when the executor opened the will. The one my grandmother signed the week she died. The one that contained a codicil she wrote in her own hand. The one she made me promise never to show anyone until the last appeal was exhausted. The one that would make my brother's blood run cold if I believed in clichés. I do not believe in clichés. I believe in chain of custody. And I had just proved the chain. The chain of evidence, I mean, not just the bank statements. Not just the deed. The chain that connected every dollar, every signature, every date on a calendar, every movement of the law's invisible machinery. I had been building it for 6 years, one monthly check at a time, one quiet filing at a time, one photograph of a sunset over the pasture that I took with my phone and saved to a folder labeled tax receipts. I had been preparing for a war I did not know I was fighting, and now I knew the terrain. The evening of the will reading arrived on a Tuesday in late October, the air carrying the first sharp edge of winter. I drove the 40 minutes into Amarillo in my pickup, the cracked windshield catching the low sun. My grandmother's shirt was buttoned to the collar, the red pearl snaps cool against my throat. I had not told Andy I was going. He would have insisted on coming, and I needed to do this alone. I needed to feel the full weight of the room without someone else's hand on my arm. The law office of Hartwell and Associates occupied the second floor of a sandstone building on Polk Street. My grandmother had bought the building in 1982, long before I was born, and the practice had operated out of the same 3 rooms ever since. I parked in the lot behind the building, took a breath, and walked up the exterior stairs. The door opened into a small reception area. The carpet was a thick burgundy, worn in the path from the door to the desk. The desk itself was empty, the receptionist gone for the day. Beyond it, the main conference room glowed with the light of 3 chandeliers, each one a cascade of crystal that my grandmother had inherited from her mother-in-law. The table was mahogany, long enough to seat 12, polished to a deep darkness that reflected the chandeliers like still water. At the far end hung the portrait of Margaret Hartwell, her silver hair pulled back, her eyes direct and unyielding, the same eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. I stepped inside. The scent of old paper and polished wood wrapped around me like a greeting. I had learned to read at this table, sitting beside my grandmother while she reviewed deeds and wills, her finger tracing lines of text. I had been 7 years old when she first taught me the concept of fraudulent conveyance. I had not understood the word then, but I understood the shape of it, the way a person could move something that belonged to someone else into a place where the law could not find it. The room filled slowly. My parents arrived first, my mother in a silk blouse the color of dried blood, my father in a navy blazer with brass buttons that I had bought him for his 65th birthday. He would not look at me. He had not looked at me in months, not since the last time I asked about the estate, and he said, "It's complicated, sweetheart," with the same gentle distance he used to describe a weather forecast. My brother Christopher came next, his wife Sandra trailing behind him like a shadow with jewelry. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him too well for a man who had never worked a day in his life. Sandra's handbag was a leather Birkin knockoff, the stitching uneven at the seams, a detail I noticed because I had spent years learning to read the quality of things by their flaws. She adjusted her diamond stud earrings, real but small, the kind a man buys to prove he can afford them without actually spending anything significant. My Uncle Paul arrived separately, a quiet man who had never contested the will, never asked for anything, never spoken to me at family gatherings except to ask how the cattle were doing. He sat at the far end of the table, folded his hands, and said nothing. The executor, a man named Harold Finch, entered last, carrying a leather portfolio. He had been my grandmother's partner for 30 years, and he knew the contents of that will better than anyone alive. He had also been the one to inform me, 7 years ago, that my parents had filed the contest. I had watched his face tighten when he told me, and I had known then that he believed the contest was meritless. But the law is not about belief. It is about standing and deadlines and the patience to let a bad argument exhaust itself. He took his seat at the head of the table. The room settled into a strained quiet, broken only by the clink of a wine glass as my brother lifted one to his lips. "We are here," Harold began, "to read the last will and testament of Margaret Aliner Hartwell, dated May 15th, 2014, with a codicil dated August 22nd of the same year." My mother's hand moved to her collar, a small gesture of self-possession. My father stared at the table. My brother set down his glass with a deliberate click. Harold opened the portfolio. "Before I begin, I am required to note that the will and codicil have been upheld by the Fourth Court of Appeals, and all challenges have been finally resolved. The estate will be distributed as directed." My brother laughed, a short, breathy sound. "Finally," he said. "Let's get on with it." Harold did not look at him. He began reading from the will, the formal language rolling over the table like a slow tide. The estate was divided into 3 sections: the Hartwell Ranch, the mineral rights under sections 14 through 22, and the liquid assets held in trust. The will left the ranch to me, the mineral rights to a conservation trust administered by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and the liquid assets to be split evenly between Christopher and the same conservation trust. I watched my brother's face as the words landed. The smirk did not disappear, but it hardened, the corners of his mouth pulling tight. "That's not what we discussed," he said, his voice low. Harold did not respond. He continued reading, his voice flat, his eyes on the page. "The codicil further stipulates that any beneficiary found to have induced a breach of fiduciary duty or to have engaged in fraudulent transfer of estate assets will forfeit their share to the estate's residual beneficiary, the Hartwell Foundation." The silence that followed was not a silence of shock. It was a silence of calculation. I saw my mother's jaw tight. My father's hand, resting on the table, curled into a loose fist. Christopher's smirk flickered, then returned. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of amusement. "Because I think we all know who the real fraud is in this family." The words hung in the air. I did not turn to look at him. I kept my eyes on Harold, on the page he was holding, on the faint tremor in his hands that I had noticed the moment he walked in. "You were never really part of this family, Claire." The fork paused at my lips. The cold salmon was on the plate, the tines hovering an inch from my tongue. I had been prepared for this moment, had rehearsed it in my mind 100 times, but the actual sound of his voice speaking those words was different from the imagination. It was sharper, more deliberate, like a blade that had been sharpened specifically for this table. I did not drop the fork. I did not set it down. I held it suspended while the air in the room recrystallized around those 7 words. I registered no heat, no flinch, no tremor. Instead, I analyzed the geometry of the moment. My brother's left shoulder was raised slightly, a defensive posture. My mother's index finger tapped once on the tablecloth. My father's chin dropped a 1/4 inch, as if the words had struck him in the chest. I set the fork down. The ceramic plate received it without a sound. I looked at my brother.